The phone screen was the only light left in the studio, a cold, digital blue cutting through the shadows. My thumb hovered, then pressed send, before my better judgment could intervene. I need you to show me what vulnerability looks like. The message hung there, glowing and dangerous. Amara wasn't just a subject. She was a fortress of discipline and high-status control. Sending that text wasn't just a direction. It was a demolition order for the professional boundary standing between us. The screen went dark, leaving me alone with the hum of the strobe lights and the terrifying weight of the silence. I have built my career on a simple, invasive premise. I don't photograph people. I photograph the secrets they keep from themselves. My gallery retrospective was 3 months away, a career-defining survey of 20 years of portraiture, but the center wall remained blank. The curator had left that space empty, a silent accusation that I had yet to capture the defining image of this decade. I needed an anchor. I needed a subject who could hold the weight of the entire exhibition without crumbling. Then I met Amara. Amara wasn't just an architect. She was a force of structural nature. She designed brutalist masterpieces, concrete, steel, unyielding lines that refused to apologize for their existence. She was exactly like her buildings, impressive, impenetrable, and utterly terrified of softness. She wore her reputation like a shield, and her success was a wall she had built, brick by brick, to keep the world at a manageable distance. Our first meeting wasn't in my studio, with its peeling paint and smell of fixer. It was in her boardroom, 40 floors up, surrounded by glass that cost more than my first 3 apartments combined. She sat at the head of a mahogany table that stretched for miles, wearing a suit so tailored it looked like it had been poured over her skin. The air in the room was sterile, recycled, and perfectly temperature-controlled. The exact opposite of the humid, chemical-scented chaos where I did my work. "I've seen your work, Elena," she said, not looking up from a blueprint. Her voice was low, precise, like she was cutting the air with a scalpel. "You like to break things." "I like to see how things are made," I corrected, leaning back in a leather chair that was designed to enforce good posture. "Sometimes that requires disassembly." She looked at me then. Her eyes were dark, intelligent, and guarded by a heavy pair of architectural frames. There was a friction between us immediately, a static charge generated by the collision of my fluid, chaotic process and her rigid, structural world. She lived in a world of load-bearing walls and safety margins. I lived in the moments when those walls collapsed. "I need a portrait for the firm's rebranding," she stated, treating the request like a procurement order for steel beams. "Professional, authoritative, unflinching. I don't do corporate headshots, Amara." "I know. I want art. But I want art that respects the structure." I studied her. The tension in her jaw, the way her hand rested on the table, fingers splayed, claiming the space, but the knuckles white. She was a woman who held the world up by sheer force of will. The challenge wasn't lighting her. The challenge was finding the woman who lived inside that fortress. If I could get her to put down the load, even for a second, the image would be the centerpiece I was missing. "I'll do it," I said, "on one condition. You come to my territory, my studio. No assistants, no PR team, no armor." She hesitated. For a split second, I saw the calculation behind her eyes, the risk assessment running in real time. She was used to controlling the environment, manipulating the light and space to suit her design. I was asking her to step into a space where she couldn't control the angles. "Tuesday," she said, closing the file. "Don't make me regret this." We shook hands. Her grip was firm, cool, and detached. But when I pulled away, I felt a lingering heat on my palm, a ghost of energy that didn't match the coldness of her presentation. It felt like a fault line waiting to slip. I left the building knowing 2 things. This shoot would either be a masterpiece or it would be a disaster. There would be no middle ground. Tuesday morning arrived with a gray, diffused light that filtered through the industrial windows of my loft, aggressive and unforgiving. The studio smelled of its history, acrid fixer, old pine floorboards, and the stale electric warmth of the strobe capacitors charging. It was a space of organized wreckage, a sanctuary where I dismantled people to see how they worked. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light, indifferent to the high stakes of the day. I checked the sync speed on my camera for the 3rd time, a nervous tick I thought I'd outgrown a decade ago. Amara arrived 15 minutes early. Of course she did. Lateness was a loss of control, and Amara didn't lose anything. When the elevator cage rattled open, she stepped out like she was inspecting a construction site she intended to condemn. She wore a charcoal suit tailored to within a millimeter of its life. It wasn't clothing, it was architecture. The lapels were sharp enough to cut glass, the fabric absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. She had armored herself against me. Her hair was pulled back into a severe knot, exposing the long, elegant line of her neck. But her posture dared me to look at it. "You're early," I said, setting down my light meter. "I'm prepared," she corrected. She set her bag down on a stool, not a single movement wasted. She looked around the studio, her gaze lingering on the fraying velvet of the fainting couch and the tangle of cables near the power pack. She didn't say it was messy, but she didn't have to. Her silence was a critique. We moved to the psych wall. I had set up a simple 3-light configuration, wanting to strip away the drama and focus on the face. She stood on the mark, adjusted her jacket, and turned to the lens. And there it was. The mask. As soon as I lifted the camera, she engaged the CEO face. I'd seen it in magazines. It was practiced, polished, and utterly impenetrable. Her chin lifted slightly, her eyes narrowed with a simulated intensity that conveyed power, but revealed absolutely nothing. "Click. Chin down," I instructed. She obeyed instantly. Click. Turn slightly to the left, shoulders back. Click. Click. It was infuriating. She was the perfect subject, technically speaking. She held still. She took direction with the precision of a military operative. The lighting hit her cheekbones exactly as I wanted. The catchlights in her eyes were sharp. But the photos were lies. I checked the digital tether on the monitor. The woman on the screen was a statue, a monument to success. She wasn't human. She was a press release in human form. I moved the key light, dragging the heavy stand across the floor, creating a harsher shadow. I wanted to see if I could startle her, make her squint, make her uncomfortable. She didn't flinch. She just recalibrated her expression to match the new mood. She was treating this like a negotiation she had already won. "Amara," I said, lowering the camera, "you're giving me the architect. I want the woman who lives in the house." "They are the same person," she said, her voice even, her expression unmoving. "They aren't. One of them is tired. One of them is wondering why she's here." She stiffened, just barely. A microscopic tightening of the jaw. "I am here because we have a contract." I stepped back behind the tripod, frustration coiling in my chest. This distance, the 6 feet of air between my lens and her face, was the problem. The camera was a shield for me, too. It allowed you to observe without participating. But you cannot capture vulnerability from a safe distance. You have to be within the blast radius. I looked at the perfectly composed, perfectly dead image on the monitor. The suit was doing its job. It was keeping her safe. It was keeping me out. If I wanted the shot, the one that would anchor the gallery wall, I was going to have to stop acting like a photographer and start acting like a threat. I needed to close the gap. I reached down and unhooked the tether cable. The digital umbilical cord snapped free with a sharp click, severing the connection to the monitor, to the safety of the immediate preview. I kicked the tripod legs aside. The metal clattered against the worn pine floorboards, a violent, intrusive sound that echoed in the high ceilings of the loft. Amara blinked. Just once. It was the first crack in the porcelain. "What are you doing?" she asked. Her eyes didn't move, but her focus shifted. She was tracking me now, calculating the new vector of the threat. "Changing the physics," I said. "The tripod is static, you're static. If we keep shooting like this, we're just documenting a statue. I need to find the pulse." I wrapped the camera strap around my wrist, pulling it taut like a boxer taping their hands. I moved in. The 85mm lens was heavy, a dense cylinder of glass and magnesium that felt less like a tool and more like a weapon. I stepped over the tape marks on the floor, breaching the invisible perimeter she maintained around herself, the 6-foot radius of professional courtesy. I stepped inside it. 5 feet. 4. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The air grew thinner, charged with the sudden proximity. I brought the camera up, not to my eye, but to my chest, shooting from the hip, watching her directly. "Don't look at the lens," I commanded, circling her slowly. "Look at me." She hesitated, her gaze darting between the glass eye of the camera and my own eyes. She was losing her focal point. "This is unorthodox." "This is work," I said. Click. The shutter sound was louder now, right in her face. The strobe flashed, a burst of white heat that froze the dust motes in the air. The capacitor whined as it recharged, a high-pitched, rising keen that sounded like a held breath. Wee. Silence. Click. Wee. Silence. I moved around her, a predator circling prey that refused to run. I shot her profile, the sharp, severe line of her nose, the way her ear was tucked perfectly behind a lock of dark hair. She followed my instructions with maddening technical perfection. Chin up, and she lifted it 3 degrees. Eyes left, and she struck the pose. She was giving me everything I asked for, and absolutely nothing of herself. It was a performance of compliance designed to keep me from seeing anything real. "Tell me about the last building you hated," I said, crouching low to shoot upward, lengthening the line of her power suit. "I don't hate buildings," she replied automatically, her voice smooth, rehearsed. "I critique structural inefficiencies." Click. "Liar," I whispered. "You hate bad design. It makes you angry. Show me the anger." "I am not angry, Elena. I am busy." "You're bored," I corrected, standing up and moving in closer, 3 feet now. "You're bored because you think you've already won this interaction. You think you can just outlast me." I saw the muscle in her jaw jump, a tiny, involuntary spasm of irritation. I fired the shutter 3 times in rapid succession, catching the flicker. It wasn't vulnerability yet, but it was friction. I lowered the camera, letting it hang from my wrist, and just looked at her. Really looked at her. Without the lens compressing the image, she was overwhelming. The stark, brutalist beauty of her was more potent up close. I traced the architecture of her face, the high, sharp cheekbones that could cut paper, the long, elegant column of her neck disappearing into the crisp white collar of her shirt. There was a tension running through her that was fascinating, a suspension cable pulled so tight it hummed. She held herself with a discipline that bordered on masochism, denying her body any curve, any slump, any moment of rest. It was infuriating. It was captivating. I wanted to capture the collapse of that discipline. I wanted to see what happened when the cable snapped. "You're holding your breath," I observed softly. "I am breathing perfectly fine." "You're breathing to survive," I said, "not to feel." She stared at me, her dark eyes flashing with a warning. "Back off." That was the message. Stay on your side of the line. But the line was the problem. The air between us was too empty. Words were bouncing off her armor like pebbles against a tank. I couldn't direct her into vulnerability. I couldn't talk her into unraveling. The distance allowed her to calculate, to prepare, to defend. I realized then that I couldn't take the photo I needed from where I was standing. I couldn't be the observer anymore. I had to become the variable she couldn't predict. I had to put my hands on the structure and shake it. "I'm going to adjust you," I said. It wasn't a question. It was a notification of intent, a warning shot fired across the bow of her personal space. I didn't wait for permission. I knew instinctively that if I asked for it, she would deny it. Or worse, she would grant it with that cool, detached benevolence that made me want to scream. I needed to bypass the boardroom negotiations and go straight to the physical reality. I stepped into the zone where the air gets thin, crossing the invisible boundary she projected around herself like a force field. I walked right up to the edge of her, close enough to feel the displacement of the air. My hand found her left shoulder. The contact was electric. Not in a romantic way, not yet, but in the way a ground wire sparks when it hits a live circuit. It was a collision of systems. Through the fine, expensive grain of her charcoal silk shirt, I felt the heat of her skin. It was shocking. Visually, Amara was a study in cryogenics. Cold lines, frozen expressions, icy composure. But underneath the architecture of the suit, she was burning. She was radiating a feverish, suppressed energy that vibrated against my palm. She flinched. It was tiny. If I had been looking through the viewfinder, I might have missed it. But I was right there, my palm cupping the tension in her deltoid, and I felt the microscopic recoil. It was a glitch in the machine, a crack in the facade. For a fraction of a second, the CEO vanished, and a human woman startled under the weight of a stranger's hand. "Relax," I murmured, my voice dropping an octave, slipping under the radar of her defenses. "Drop the weight, Amara. You're carrying the whole skyline on this deltoid." My thumb pressed into the muscle, a tactile command. She didn't relax. She vibrated. The tension didn't leave, it changed frequency. It shifted from the rigidity of steel to the trembling tension of a bowstring pulled back to its breaking point. She was holding herself together by sheer, terrifying force of will. "I am relaxed," she said. But her voice was tight, breathless, betraying her. "No," I corrected, moving my other hand to her elbow, my fingers brushing the soft inner skin of her arm as I guided it down. "You're bracing for impact. There is no impact coming. Just me. Just me." The words hung in the silence between the strobe recharges, heavy and implication-laden. The proximity was doing something to the room. It was creating a feedback loop. I could smell her now, a complex, dark scent of sandalwood and something sharper, cleaner, like rain hitting hot pavement in the summer. It filled my lungs, dizzying and grounded all at once. My own pulse kicked against my ribs, a traitorous, hammering rhythm that had nothing to do with aperture or shutter speed, and everything to do with the woman standing inches from my chest. I wasn't just adjusting a model anymore. I was touching a woman who terrified and fascinated me in equal measure. And my hands were lingering a second too long to be professional. I stepped back, but only half a step. I brought the camera up, but I didn't look through it. I looked over the top of the magnesium body, meeting her eyes directly, unflinching. Usually, when you look at a subject over the camera, they look away. They look for the lens, for the mechanical eye that validates them. Amara didn't look for the lens. She locked onto me. Her pupils were blown wide, black holes absorbing the studio lights. The look wasn't professional. It was raw. It was a challenge. "You touched me," her eyes said. "Now what?" "Breathe," I ordered, holding her gaze. "In through the nose. Hold it." She inhaled. I watched the rise of her chest, the way the silk strained against her ribs, the way her lips parted just slightly. "Release." She let the breath out in a shuddering sigh, and for 1 second, the armor slipped. Her eyes softened, losing that laser-focused edge and becoming liquid, dark, and deep. Click. I caught it. Or I thought I did. But the moment shattered as soon as the shutter fired. She snapped back into place, the walls slamming up faster than before. The air in the room was suddenly too thick to breathe, consumed by the heat that had just jumped the gap between us. "Cut," I said, my voice rougher than I intended. "We need a break." "Cut," I said. The word fell like a heavy stone into a deep well, the splash echoing in the sudden silence. Amara didn't argue. She didn't ask why. She simply broke the pose, the tension leaving her frame not with a release, but with a rigid, controlled withdrawal. She turned on her heel, the movement sharp enough to sever the air between us, and walked toward the dressing area. The heavy velvet curtains swooshed shut behind her, a final, soft barrier sealing her away. I was left alone with the humming lights and the smell of ozone. The studio felt suddenly vast, the shadows stretching out from the corners like encroaching tidewater. I walked to the monitor station, my boots sounding too loud on the worn wood. I needed to see what we had. I needed to justify the erratic pounding of my own heart. I scrolled through the images, the digital tether feeding them onto the high-resolution screen. Perfect, perfect, perfect. And completely dead. Here was Amara the architect, Amara the CEO, Amara the woman who didn't make mistakes. The lighting was exquisite, Rembrandt style, carving her cheekbones out of the shadow, highlighting the intelligence in her forehead. The focus was razor sharp, catching every eyelash, every pore. But there was no person there, just a beautiful, expensive surface. I had captured the fortress, but I hadn't found the door. The eyes were open, but the shutters were closed. I felt a surge of frustration so hot it tasted like copper in my mouth. I was failing. She was winning. She would leave here with a beautiful, hollow portrait that would hang in a boardroom and tell the world exactly what she wanted them to know, that she was untouchable. And I would be the photographer who helped her build the lie. I couldn't let that happen. My phone sat on the equipment cart. the screen dark and reflective like a black mirror. I picked it up. My hands were steady, which surprised me, considering the chaotic rhythm of my pulse. The camera had failed, the lights had failed, my voice, my direction, my physical intrusion into her space, it hadn't been enough. I needed a different weapon. I needed to bypass the visual and go straight to the psychological. I needed to whisper in her ear when she thought she was safe. I opened our message thread. Her number was at the top, saved from the sterile coordination of the shoot. I typed without letting myself think about the consequences. The letters appeared on the screen, glowing blue in the dim studio light. I need you to show me what vulnerability looks like. I stared at the words. They were demanding, intimate, unprofessional. They were a challenge issued directly to her core, a dare wrapped in a request. It was the kind of text you send to a lover at 2 a.m. when the walls are down, not a client at 11 a.m. in the middle of a contract. My thumb hovered over the send button. This was the cliff edge. If I pressed it, I was stepping out of the role of photographer and into something else, something undefined, dangerous, and irreversible. I was acknowledging that what was happening between us wasn't just about f-stops and shutter speeds. I was admitting that I wanted to see her undone. I pressed send. Whoosh. The sound was ridiculously cheerful for something that felt like pulling the pin on a grenade. I set the phone down, face up. The screen dimmed, then went black, leaving me in the dark. Regret hit me instantly, cold and sharp. I had gone too far. She was going to walk out. She was going to fire me. She was going to tell the gallery curator that I was unprofessional, that I had crossed a line that should never be crossed. She would leave, and the center wall of my exhibition would remain blank, a testament to my inability to break through. But underneath the regret, there was a thrill, a dark, electric current of anticipation that made my skin prickle. Because I knew she had seen it. I knew she was standing behind that velvet curtain, phone in hand, reading the words that stripped away the pretense of the last 2 hours. I had thrown the gauntlet. Now I had to wait to see if she would pick it up or slap me with it. The studio silence stretched, tight and singing like a wire about to snap. Then I heard it. The sound of the dressing room curtain rings sliding across the metal rod. Shh, clack. I turned, bracing myself. I expected to see her storming out, coat on, bag in hand, ready to leave. I prepared my apology, my defense, my professional retreat. But the main studio floor remained empty. She hadn't come back to the set. She hadn't walked toward the exit elevator. The space where she should have been standing was vacant. I frowned, stepping away from the monitor. Where was she? Amara? I called out. Nothing. Just the hum of the strobe pack cooling down. Then I saw the movement in the back of the studio. Past the equipment racks, past the prop storage. A shadow, moving against the shadows. She wasn't leaving. She was going deeper. She was heading toward the darkroom. I waited for the sound of the elevator. I waited for the sharp, decisive click of Italian leather heels marching toward the exit, signaling the end of the contract and the beginning of a lawsuit. That was the logical conclusion to the grenade I had just thrown. But the studio remained stubbornly, terrifyingly silent. The only sound was the low, electric hum of the strobe pack cooling down, a technological sigh that seemed to mock my anxiety. She wasn't leaving. I stepped away from the digital tether, the blue light of the monitor fading behind me, and moved toward the shadows where I had seen her silhouette. My studio is a long, converted industrial loft. The front is all light and air, the stage where the performance happens. But the back is different. The back is storage, chemicals, narrow hallways, and the heavy, light-tight revolving door of the darkroom. It's the subconscious of the building, a place where images are born in darkness. Amara was walking straight into it. She passed through a shaft of dusty daylight falling from a high, clear-story window, and I stopped dead. The visual shock of it hit me harder than the text message. She had changed. The armor, that impeccable structural charcoal jacket that had deflected every photon of light I threw at it, was gone. It had been discarded somewhere in the dressing room, left behind like a shed skin. She was in just the silk shirt now, a deep slate color that clung to her frame without the scaffolding of the blazer. And she had rolled up her sleeves. It seems like such a small thing, a mundane adjustment for comfort. But on Amara, it looked like an act of violence. She had exposed her forearms, the pale, smooth skin marked by the faint impression of a watch band she had also removed. It was a stripping down, a dismantling of the facade. For the first time, she looked like she belonged to the space rather than the boardroom. I followed her. The dynamic had shifted so abruptly, I nearly stumbled. For the last 2 hours, I had been the director, the voice of authority, the one commanding the light and the angle. Now, I was the observer. I was the one being led. She moved with a different kind of purpose now, not the clipped, efficient stride of the executive, but a prowling, deliberate gait. She wasn't marching. She was hunting. She stopped at the end of the hallway, right in front of the darkroom entrance. The air back here was cooler, smelling faintly of acetic acid and old paper, the sharp vinegar scent of stop bath. It was a smell that usually calmed me, the scent of process and control. Today, it smelled like a trap. She didn't turn around immediately. She let me approach, let me close the distance until I was standing 10 feet away, then 5. The hallway was narrow, forcing a kind of intimacy that the open studio floor had prevented. Here, there was nowhere to retreat. Then she turned. The CEO face was gone. In its place was something harder, sharper, and infinitely more terrifying. Her eyes were dark, dilated in the dim light, and they locked onto mine with a weight that made it hard to breathe. She wasn't looking at me like a photographer she had hired. She was looking at me like a problem she intended to solve. "You take risks, Elena," she said. Her voice was low, stripped of the professional modulation she used in meetings. It was husky, real. It vibrated in the narrow space between us. "I take photos," I replied, though my voice sounded thin to my own ears. "Sometimes they require risks." "You asked for vulnerability." She took a step toward me, the space compressed. I could see the pulse jumping in the hollow of her throat, a frantic, human rhythm betraying the stillness of her face. "You sent a demand to my phone while standing 20 feet away from me. That isn't art. That's provocation." "Did it work?" I asked. The question was a whisper, a gamble. She studied me, her gaze traveling over my face, dissecting my own defenses. She looked at the camera still dangling from my wrist, my shield, my barrier. Then she looked back at my eyes, her expression unreadable, but intensely charged. "You want to see what's underneath the structure?" she asked. "You want to see what happens when the load-bearing walls come down?" "Yes." "Then stop hiding behind the lens." She reached out, her fingers brushing the cold metal of the camera body, pushing it gently aside so nothing stood between us. "You can't document this, Elena. You have to experience it." She turned back to the heavy, black revolving door. It was a cylinder of iron and rubber, designed to let people in without letting light in. It was a seal, a sanctuary. "I'm going in," she said, her hand resting on the black metal. "If you want your answer, you'll follow. If you want to stay safe, go back to your lights." She didn't wait for my response. She pushed the door. The heavy cylinder groaned, rotating with a sluggish, mechanical sound, swallowing her into the darkness. Thump whoosh. And then she was gone, leaving me alone in the hallway with the smell of chemicals and the echo of her challenge. I stepped into the cylinder. The heavy iron door pushed back against my weight, a reluctant, grinding rotation that felt less like entering a room and more like sealing a vault. Thump whoosh. The light from the hallway was cut off instantly, severed by the mechanism. For a heartbeat, I was suspended in absolute, suffocating darkness. The air inside was different, denser, cooler, and heavy with the metallic tang of silver nitrate and the sharp vinegar bite of acetic acid. It was the smell of my sanctuary, the place where I usually felt most in control. But in the pitch black, with the sound of Amara's breathing somewhere in the void, it felt like I had stepped into the belly of a beast. The ventilation system hummed a low, constant drone, vibrating through the floorboards, isolating us from the rest of the building. We were underground now, regardless of the elevation. "Close the door," her voice came from the corner, disembodied and velvety. "It's a revolving door, Amara. It's always closed." Click. The safe light snapped on. The room flooded with deep, blood-red illumination. It's a specific frequency of light designed not to damage sensitive paper, but it does strange things to the human eye. It strips away color, contrast, and depth perception. It turns the world into a monochromatic dreamscape of shadows and crimson highlights. And it turned Amara into a myth. She was leaning against the wet bench, her hip resting against the stainless steel sink where I washed my prints. In the red light, the slate silk of her shirt looked black, and her skin glowed with a subterranean luminescence. She had rolled her sleeves higher, exposing the tendons in her forearms, and her hair, usually so severe, had a loose strand falling across her forehead. She looked undone. She looked magnificent. I walked to the dry counter, my movements feeling sluggish in the thick air. I set my camera down. It was useless here. There was not enough light for the sensor, and the autofocus would hunt forever in the monochrome. Then I set my phone down next to it. As soon as the glass touched the Formica, the screen lit up. In the red gloom, the cool blue light of the screen was jarring. I looked down. It wasn't a text. It was a location notification, a digital echo. Amara. Her name glowed on the screen, a ghost in the machine, confirming the impossible reality that the woman who lived in the sky was now standing in my darkroom. The blue light reflected off the developing trays, casting a strange, bruised purple shadow against the red. "This is where you hide," she said. It wasn't a question. She ran a finger along the edge of a developing tray, inspecting the residue of my work. "This is where I tell the truth," I corrected, my voice dropping instinctively to match the hushed acoustics of the tiled room. "Out there, under the strobes, everyone lies. They give me the face they want the world to see. In here, in the dark, you can't fake the exposure. The chemistry doesn't care about your reputation. And you think I'm lying out there? I think you're performing." She pushed off the counter and moved toward me. The room was small, barely 8 feet by 10, and her movement consumed the available space. In the studio, I was the director. I controlled the lights, the angles, the timing. But here, in this red womb, the hierarchy had inverted. She moved with the silent, predatory grace of someone who understood that structure wasn't just about steel beams. It was about leverage. "You asked for vulnerability," she whispered. The acoustics of the small room caught her voice and amplified the rasp of it. I could hear the intake of her breath, the friction of silk against her skin. "You think vulnerability is weeping? You think it's breaking down? I think it's letting yourself be seen without the armor." She stopped 2 feet from me. The red light carved deep shadows into her eye sockets and under her cheekbones, making her look skull-like and beautiful. "Vulnerability isn't weakness, Elena. It's absolute trust. It's handing someone the weapon that can destroy you and trusting them not to pull the trigger." She reached out, her hand hovering in the space between us. In the red light, I couldn't tell if she was reaching for me or pushing me away. "I'm not trying to destroy you," I said, my voice barely holding steady. "Aren't you?" She stepped closer, invading my personal space, collapsing the distance I had fought so hard to bridge in the studio. "You want to strip me down. You want to take the one thing I've spent 20 years building, my invulnerability, and hang it on a gallery wall for strangers to stare at. That is destruction. That's immortality. It's the same thing." She was close enough now that I could feel the heat radiating off her, a physical force that warred with the cool chemical air of the room. The space between us had vanished. There was no lens, no shutter, no professional courtesy left. Just the red light, the smell of acid, and the terrifying realization that I had trapped myself in the dark with the one thing I couldn't control. I turned away from her, needing to anchor my hands to something that obeyed the laws of physics. The intensity of her gaze was stripping the oxygen from the room, leaving me lightheaded in the red gloom. I reached for the tongs, but my fingers fumbled, so I abandoned the tools and grabbed the edge of the developing tray with my bare hands. There was no paper in the chemistry, no latent image waiting to be born, but I needed the ritual. I needed the rhythm of agitation to counter the erratic hammering of my own heart. I began to rock the tray. Lift left, lower right. Lift back, lower front. The liquid sloshed gently against the high plastic sides, a rhythmic, wet sound that filled the silence. The smell of hydroquinone rose up, sharp and familiar, the scent of potential, of things coming into being. "What are you doing?" Amara asked. Her voice was closer now. She had moved while my back was turned, closing the gap until I could feel the warmth of her body radiating against my spine. She wasn't touching me, not yet, but she was occupying my atmosphere. "I'm processing," I said, staring down into the dark, swirling liquid. The red safe light turned the developer into a pool of black ink, opaque and bottomless. "It's all chemistry, Amara. You take a moment that's invisible, a latent image, and you submerge it in the dark. You agitate it. You force a reaction. If you do it right, the truth rises to the surface. If you leave it too long, it turns black and ruins everything. And if you pull it out too soon, then it fades. It's a ghost. It never becomes real." She moved to my side, her hip brushing against the edge of the wet bench. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the stainless steel, looking down into the tray with me. In this light, the sharp angles of her face were softened. The severe architecture of her jawline blurred into something more fluid, more human. The red glow caught the sheen of perspiration on her neck, a visual betrayal of her cool composure. We were standing shoulder to shoulder, staring into the chemical void, and the air between us was so thick with unsaid things that it felt heavy in my lungs. "I don't like ghosts," she whispered. "Then why are you haunting my darkroom?" She turned her head. Her face was inches from mine. I could see the dark dilation of her pupils, swallowing the red light. I could smell the rain scent of her skin over the acrid bite of the chemicals. "I'm not haunting you, Elena. I'm hiding." "From who? The board of directors? The critics?" "From the chaos." She said the word like it was a physical enemy she had fought for decades. "My life is a grid. It is load calculations and safety margins and structures that do not move. I built it that way because I know what happens when the foundation shifts. I know what it feels like to fall." She shifted her weight, turning her body fully toward me, trapping me between her heat and the cold edge of the sink. "But when you look at me," she continued, her voice dropping to a rough murmur that vibrated in my chest, "when you look at me over that camera, you don't see the grid. You see the fault lines. You look at me and I feel the structure shaking. It is terrifying." "Good," I said, my hand still gripping the tray, knuckles white, rocking the liquid faster now. "You need to shake. You've been static for too long." "I don't want to be static," she admitted. "I want to be developed." The word hung there, wet and heavy. I stopped rocking the tray. The liquid settled into a glass-still surface, reflecting the red bulb above us and the shadow of our two heads, close enough to merge. Amara reached out. She didn't reach for my face or my waist. She reached into the tray. It was a violation of every protocol. You don't put your bare hands in the chemistry. You don't contaminate the process. But she didn't care about the process. She slid her hand into the developer, breaking the surface tension, her fingers slipping through the slick, cool liquid until they found mine. Her hand covered my hand where I gripped the bottom of the tray. The sensation was a shock to the system. The cold, viscous chemicals and the searing, impossible heat of her palm. Her fingers laced through mine, underwater, in the dark. It was messy. It was reckless. It was the most intimate thing that had ever happened to me in a studio. She squeezed my hand, her grip strong, architectural, grounding me in the fluid. "I am showing you," she whispered, her breath hitching slightly. "I am stepping into the dark. I am letting the chemicals touch me. Is this what you wanted? Is this vulnerable enough for you?" I looked down at our hands, submerged and intertwined in the black liquid, staining our skin, changing us. The photo didn't matter anymore. The retrospective didn't matter. The only thing that existed was the pressure of her fingers and the way she was looking at me, like I was the only structure left standing in a world that had just collapsed. "No," I breathed. "I want more." I pulled our hands from the chemical bath, dragging hers with me. The developer dripped back into the black pool, a rhythmic, wet countdown. Plip, 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 that echoed in the silence of the red room. I reached for the towel on the counter, not breaking eye contact, and began to dry her hand. It was a mundane action, cleaning up a spill, removing the chemical residue. But in the heavy, pressurized air of the dark room, it felt like a rite. I wiped the hydroquinone from her fingers, tracing the length of each digit, drying the palm that had just offered itself to me. She watched me, her breathing shallow, her chest rising and falling against the slate silk of her shirt. She didn't pull away. She let me tend to her, standing perfectly still in the center of my sanctuary. "We stopped working," she whispered. the observation hanging between us. We started feeling, I corrected. I dropped the towel. It landed softly on the floor, forgotten. We were standing in the red gloom, the safe light turning our skin into something monochromatic and strange. The distance was gone. The professional boundary lay somewhere back in the hallway, shattered by the revolving door. But I couldn't just take. That was the photographer's instinct, to capture, to steal the moment for the sake of the image. This required something else. Amara, I said, my voice low, absorbed by the small tiled room. I need to ask you for something. You have the photo, she replied, though she sounded unsure, her voice lacking its usual authority. I don't care about the photo. I need permission. She tilted her head, the crimson shadows shifting across her face. Permission for what? I stepped closer until the toes of my boots touched hers. I need to touch you, not to adjust a pose, not to correct the light. I need to know the texture of the structure without the lens in the way. The request hung there. It was dangerous. It was the point of no return. If she said no, we would walk out of this room as strangers who had shared a confused moment in the dark. If she said yes, the architecture of our relationship would fundamentally change. She looked at me, searching my face for any sign of deception. She found none. I was open, terrified, and wanting. You want to inspect the foundation, she murmured. I want to know if the fortress is real. She exhaled, a long, shuddering sound that seemed to empty her lungs of all the air she had been holding since she walked into my studio. Her gaze held mine, unflinching. Permission granted. I lifted my hand. It moved slowly through the red air, heavy with intent. I placed my fingertips on her jawline. The contact was electric. Her skin was burning, fever hot against my cool fingers. I traced the sharp, architectural line of her bone structure, mapping the tension that lived there. She leaned into my touch, her eyes fluttering shut, the resistance draining out of her shoulders. You're shaking, she whispered. I'm calibrating. My thumb brushed the hollow of her cheek, then moved down to the pulse point in her neck. It was hammering, a frantic, bird-like rhythm that betrayed the icy control she projected to the world. She wasn't made of steel. She was blood and breath and terrifying fragility. Elena. She breathed my name like a confession. I didn't wait. I closed the final inch of distance. The kiss wasn't a collision. It was a precision engagement. It was a slow, deliberate read of intentions. I felt the precise texture of her hesitation, and then the overwhelming weight of her surrender. Her lips were soft, yielding in a way that shocked me. She tasted of mint and the metallic tang of the darkroom air. She made a sound, a low, guttural noise of release, and her hands came up to grip my waist, pulling me in, anchoring me. The kiss deepened. It wasn't polite anymore. It was hungry. It was a conversation we had been having with our eyes for 3 hours, finally translated into a language we both understood. I felt the armor dissolve. The rigid posture, the held breath, the structural discipline, it all crumbled. She wasn't an architect anymore. She was just a woman in the dark, holding on to me like I was the only solid thing in the world. We broke apart, gasping, but didn't separate. She rested her forehead against mine, her eyes closed, her hands clutching my shirt. We stood there, in the sanctuary of the red light, breathing the same air, the silence heavy with the truth of what had just happened. Is this it? She asked, her voice wrecked. Is this vulnerability? No, I whispered, running my hand down her spine. This is trust. The gallery was a vacuum of white noise and white walls, smelling of expensive Chardonnay and judgment. 3 months is a lifetime in the art world, but standing there, the scent of the darkroom felt fresher than the perfume of the donors. The retrospective was a triumph. The centerpiece hung on the far wall, commanding the room. The curator had expected the studio portrait, the perfect, sharp focus image of the architect in her fortress. I gave them the truth instead. It was a grainy, high-contrast print, blown up until the silver grain looked like skin texture. The image was bathed in deep, saturated shadows. It showed a woman in a darkroom, illuminated only by the red safe light. Her head was bowed, forehead resting against a figure barely visible in the periphery. It wasn't a portrait of power. It was a portrait of the moment power is voluntarily surrendered. The room buzzed with hushed theories about the mysterious, intimate atmosphere of the shot. Amara stood next to me. She had rebuilt the walls for the public. Her tuxedo was impeccable, her hair severe, her posture rigid. To the critics surrounding us, she was the imposing subject, a woman of steel and glass. But down in the crush of the crowd, where the sightlines were blocked, her hip pressed firmly against mine. It was a point of contact that grounded me in the chaos. The critic from the Times says the red light symbolizes danger, she murmured, her voice barely audible over the hum of conversation. She didn't look at me. She stared straight ahead at her own vulnerability hanging on the wall. The critic from the Times doesn't know the difference between danger and heat, I replied, swirling my champagne. He says the subject looks defeated. Does she? Amara turned then. The movement was small, precise, but the look she gave me carried the weight of every night we'd spent together since that first one. No. She looks like she finally found a place to rest. Her hand found mine in the folds of her jacket, squeezing tight. The public saw a masterpiece of composition. We saw the contract we had signed in the dark. Let them keep the print, she whispered, the corner of her mouth lifting in a secret, devastating smile. I'm going home with the photographer. One reckless text message was the key that unlocked the room. I sent a challenge into the void, and she answered by stepping into the dark. The door clicked shut behind her. There was no going back now. If you want to see what happens when the lights go out, check out the next video. Subscribe for more stories developed in the shadows.